Alright, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Made to Pray podcast. You're joining us on episode 105, and we'll get to our guest in a minute. I am delighted to be joined here at the start of this episode by my co-host, Sarah. How you doing, Sarah? Good to see you.
Did I get a raise over Christmas?
I don't know about that there. I think there's a packet of M&M's here with your name on it. So, how you doing anyway? Good.
Yeah, all good. It feels like a very long time since I've been here, but Happy New Year anyway. Glad to
Yes,
be back.
Happy New Year. And in fact, it's been 2 months since the last time we did anything together here. So I know I've had a few wee health issues and stuff that's kind of impacted that as well. But it's good to be back in the swing of things, you know. So
Absolutely. And good to see you in one piece.
well, that's always, well, some people may not be happy about that as well, like, but I appreciate the sentiment there, like, at least. But looking forward to a new series of podcasts here. We're hoping to go maybe once every couple of weeks rather than trying to put a pressure on ourselves to do one every week. We're kicking off this week with Gordon Ramsey, not the chef, folks, but ethnomusicologist.
I know, I was very excited when I saw the message that we might get something delicious to eat.
Thinking you were going to get like some fried chicken or something like here, or gnocchi, or a beef Wellington kind of done up. Yeah. Well, that's kind of his thing, isn't it? Sort of the Hell's Kitchen on Made to Parade. So Gordon Ramsey is going to be our guest, talking a bit about a chapter he's written for a new book in relation to the kind of the social responsibility roles that bonds are playing now within their communities. And we've also got a couple of other ideas up our sleeve in regards to that. We have finally the top 5 melody recordings is going to come out. I know some people have been waiting for.
I've been losing sleep over it, Glenn.
I know you have. And where do we do the top 5 accordion?
I know.
Oh, jeez.
Is that my job?
That's your job, and I will sit on the sidelines for that. So it is, because what do I know about accordions, really? You know what I mean? And then we're going to do something I think that will be extremely interesting for some people, which is a series I'm calling Scripture / a Memory. And it's the idea of trying to connect some of the things that we do within bond life and within the community in terms of connected to the Reformation, Glorious Revolution, and I suppose given some kind of scriptural foundation for some of the things that we do as part of day-to-day life here. And I know you have some ideas in regards to that as well.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing it, actually. I've been very, very interested in that the last few months and had the opportunity recently to speak to Ron Johnson and Ellis Hanna about not specifically the band scene, but loyalism and orangism and how compatible or otherwise that is with Christianity, because it is a real talking point, actually. And a lot of people feel quite convicted that is this something that I should be engaging with? Is it something that's actually good, or is it something I should be wary of? So I think that's really interesting to look at. And I came away with a very, very positive idea of what it is that we're doing.
Okay, well, looking forward to us joining the dots up in regards to that as well. I think it could be really interesting. I think there may be a lot of people out there wanting to kind of look at that too. So we'll do that. But tonight, it's all about Gordon and his kind of take on this idea of social responsibility and bonds. So, folks, sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation with Gordon Ramsey. So, folks, here we are on episode 105 of Made to Parade. It's been a wee while, as we said in the intro, since we did an episode, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined on this one by Gordon Ramsey. Gordon, 2 famous names on the podcast here. We've got Glenn Miller, Gordon Ramsey. I'm going to be cooking up a storm with you on Route 66 here, so all good. So, Gordon, welcome along to Made to Parade. Great to have you here.
Thank you, mate. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good stuff. So, Gordon, you're a semi-retired ethnomusicologist, right? So give people an idea as to what that actually is, to try and help us frame some of the work that you've done, because we're going to talk about a couple of things specifically tonight about a chapter that you've written for another book, but this isn't your first foray into literature. You've written another book, but if you could kind of give us a wee bit of a background to where all that's come from, that'd be amazing.
Sure. So ethnomusicology, or ethno-what, as most people call it, is the anthropology of music. It's the study of music, but not the study of music the way a musicologist would study it, but music as culture and as social life. And my research has been focused on marching bands in Northern Ireland from that point of view. Now, it's not, I don't ignore the music is also relevant, but there's more to ethnomusicology than just the music. It's music as life.
Okay, and what was it that kind of drew you into bands? Because it's not necessarily what some people might think of as, oh, I'm going to go and study some of that. What was it that drew your attention to bands in the first place?
It's a mixture of background and blind coincidence. I'm originally from Ireland. I was born in the border area of the Republic. My father was an Irish Presbyterian. My mother was English. They met after World War II. But I lived there for 3 years and then we moved to England. But I always knew that my roots were on the other side of the water. And we used to visit every year. And I remember sitting in my uncle's kitchen in which there was a picture of King Billy hanging over the mantelpiece, listening to my cousin playing Dubliners records on the record player and taking it all in. And thinking, oh, this is all part of me. So I was always interested in the music. I always had an affinity for the music. When I left school, I went straight into the army, not as a musician, as an infantry soldier, and served 3 tours in Northern Ireland. So I got to see quite a bit of this place when it wasn't at its best. But nevertheless, it drew me in a lot of ways. And of course, one of the things I saw was bands. And my first 12th of July was the 1979 Belfast 12th, which I remember quite vividly and took loads of photographs of at the time.
Okay. So, no, cool. So currently you're a member of Shagger Road Defenders, but that's not how you got your start with bands. Talk to us a wee bit about that happening, because that's pretty unique in terms of how you ended up with this idea of joining multiple bands at once, I suppose.
Yeah, so I didn't go to university when I was young, so I went straight into the army. So I went to university as an undergraduate at the age of 46 at Queen's. And I already knew when I started that I wanted to study bands. I had originally planned to study archaeology because I was working as a guide at an archaeological site in County Sligo. But all the mud and rain put me off that. And I discovered... So I'd sent off for the Queen's Prospectus, and when I turned over the page from archaeology, I found anthropology closely followed by ethnomusicology. And I thought, that looks like mighty crack. So that's what led me towards music, which I had no background in at all at that point. And then I decided, at least I started to think about visiting Belfast to see the 12th, which I had last seen in 1979. And my colleague, who was a good friend but a hardcore Republican, was outraged by the idea that I would go to see the 12th and upbraided me for even thinking about it. And by 5 minutes later, I'd gone from I'm thinking about going to I'm definitely going and nothing you can say will stop me. So I went to the 12th. That was 2000. It was the year it went to Ormeau Park. And there was a lot of publicity beforehand suggesting there would be trouble. There was no trouble, but it blew me away how much else was going on. I followed a band, they were called the Sons of the Somme from Ardoyne, no longer exist. They were in many ways quite a run-of-the-mill Blood and Thunder band, nothing special. And yet it struck me that they knew what they were doing. They were accomplished musicians. They had a repertoire they were completely confident in. They knew how to entertain a crowd, and they were obviously having a great time themselves. And at the same time, I was seeing lots of other little things going on. I remember one point on Balmoral Avenue, there was a guy sat watching the parade in a wheelchair, an elderly guy. And an Orangeman stepped out of the ranks and went over to this guy and took his 2 hands and held them and said to him, "I think about you all the time." And the guy didn't answer, but he had tears in his eyes. He just nodded his head. And I thought there's some story there between those 2 guys. And I thought there's so much going on here. This is so much social life. This is really, social interaction. There's romances going on. There's mates getting drunk together. There's all kinds of things going on here. And none of this ever gets written about. The only time you ever hear about parades or read about parades is when there is trouble. And by the end of that day, I knew what I wanted to study. So by the time I couldn't start university immediately because I didn't have the qualifications. I had to go to University of Ulster at McGee to get a foundation certificate.
Okay.
But once I got that, I came to Queen's knowing that when I get through my undergraduate degree, which is 3 years, I want to do a PhD studying bands.
Okay.
So that's how I got into the band world. And because I already knew that, in my second year as an undergraduate, I went to the Ulster Scots Heritage Council and said, I want to study flute bands. Can you help me? And the guy behind the desk said, well, I play in a band. I'll bring you to a practice. So that's how it started for me.
Okay. And then that kind of led to you part of your, I suppose, your thesis then became a book, which was Music, Identity, and Politics, is it? Yeah.
Music, Emotion, and Identity.
Music,
in
Emotion,
Ulster
and Identity.
Marching
There
Band.
you go. Yeah. And that was a pretty unique experience because you ended up joining a couple of bands to really throw yourself into that kind of environment, and that's where you learned to play an instrument, etc., and everything. Yeah. So talk to me about what that experience was like and what you kind of learned from that.
Yeah. So I started off by going to a workshop for the concert flute, which was run by Colin Fleming, who at that time was the lead flute with the Ulster Orchestra. Colin Fleming had learned to play in Ballyclare Victoria Flute Band. His father had been the piccolo player and then the conductor of Ballyclare Victoria. Art Fleming is still a legend in that band. And Colin had gone on to become a professional classical flute player, still had an interest in bands. And the people at that workshop were a mixture of Northern Irish concert band people and English orchestral players. And it was held in Gorchin, which is a nationalist village in Tyrone. Okay. So that was an interesting combination. I remember a particularly great sing-song in the pub. But as soon as I told the folks there who were from Ballyclare, Victoria, that I was interested in studying bands, they were like, well, join our band. So I did. And at the same time, I went to see a fella in Hollywood who had played with Ravenhill Temperance.
Okay.
And he taught me the basics of the flute. Then I played with Ballyclare Victoria, Billy Rutherford, that was,
right,
for those who remember him. God bless him. Then I played with Ballyclare Victoria, and that was hard work because Ballyclare Victoria were very focused on competition, mostly playing classical music.
Yeah.
They did a few parades at that time. They don't parade anymore. But their focus was very much on classical music. And they were very, very good. They were, at one point, they won, I think, 9 titles in a row. And they were masters of what they did. But I didn't find it that enjoyable.
Right, okay.
And you had to be committed to the competition to really keep doing that. And me and a friend, Sam Quarry, who I've played with in numerous bands, were invited to join a neighbouring band, which was Sir George White Memorial in Brashane.
Okay.
And they're a melody band playing in a military style, part harmonies, but very much focused on street music, not on classical music.
Sure.
And so I played with them for several years, and I found that a lot more enjoyable. But I still continued to play with Ballyclare Victoria for some time, so I was in 2 bands.
Sure.
And after I'd been in Sir George White Memorial for a while, but me and Sam again got invited to join Ballykeel, Loyal Sons of Ulster from Ballymena, who are a jig-style Blood and Thunder band.
Can you hear all the Pride of the Main fans booing there?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So that rivalry is just as intense as it ever was. So no, I'll say nothing about the monkeys. Good people. And that was a different style of music again. It was mostly traditional tunes and not traditional song tunes, but traditional dance tunes. So it was quite complex and intricate music. And it was all taught by ear. They didn't read music. They actually had their own notation system using numbers that they invented themselves. So this was 3 very different bands within a fairly small area.
Sure.
To the outside world, they're all just Loyalist bandsmen. But when you're in those bands, or even if you're part of the scene, you know that these are not the same at all. And I thought, what attracts people to these different bands? Why do people end up following these very different musical paths? And that's what I explored in the PhD and ultimately in the book. And I described the experience of being in these different kinds of bands. And I related people's musical tastes to the element of social class. So there's a clear pattern that the Ballyclare Victoria tended to attract people from more affluent and more educated backgrounds to playing classical music. Sir George White Memorial was in an intermediate place, primarily working class band, but some people from upper working class situations certainly wanted to present a respectable image. Mm-hmm. And Ballyclare and Ballykeel, more in the Blood and Thunder world, pretty much largely recruited on the Ballykeel estate. Yeah. But as they built their reputation, they did start to attract people from elsewhere. But an overwhelmingly working class band.
Yeah, reflective of the area that they came from. Yeah,
very much. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
And the skills that they had and the tastes that they had, the kind of music they enjoyed, was related to the background to some extent. Now, you can't say that there's no rule that says I'm from this state, so I must play in this band. Sure. Of course, people do learn and change, and people went in both directions. Sam and myself started in the concert band and went to a Blood and Thunder band. Other people moved in the other direction. But nevertheless, there's a statistical tendency that if you come from this kind of background, you're more likely to end up in this kind of band.
Yeah. What would you, if you were kind of summing up what you actually learned from that experience? You know, I know it's hard to kind of, you know, put into like a sentence, whatever, that you took thousands of words to kind of describe. But what would you, when you walked away from that kind of experience, what did it leave you with in terms of, you know, findings or, you know, just discoveries?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that the marching band scene in Northern Ireland, and I can't prove this because I haven't got the statistics, but from just looking at it, it's probably the largest and most active participatory musical culture in Western Europe and possibly the whole of Europe. There's so many people playing music from such a small population that when I tell other musicologists that these 6 counties support 700 bands, mm-hmm. they're amazed that the Shankill Road alone has 7 bands.
Yeah,
they're absolutely astounded because lots of them are working with traditions that are trying to be revived because they feel they're dying. And one thing you can say about the band world is it doesn't need reviving.
No.
And the reason it doesn't need reviving is because it never lost its original social function, which was political solidarity, but it added a lot more things to that. It offers a lot more than that now. Yeah. So it's actually more relevant now than it ever was.
Yeah. And I think that leads in nicely to what I suppose the invite around this particular podcast was. You'd written recently a chapter for a book that's just been published, specifically around the idea, if I can just get the title here, this idea of sectarianism, solidarity, and social care. There's a longer title in that there, but I'm not going to go into that there. But talk to us a wee bit about where that came from and, you know, the language that you're using and stuff. For what, in terms of plain language, what is that new chapter that you've written all about?
Okay, so that chapter started when I was playing with Shankill Road Defenders, which I joined that band after I finished my my PhD research. So I noticed we were starting to get invited to do charity gigs. Now, I'd done charity gigs before with Sir George White Memorial, but they weren't quite the same. They were something that was organised by the band once a year for Diabetes UK. It was to honour our former conductor who had sadly died of diabetes, and also his widow, who was a guest of honour at the event. And it was also building the band's reputation and forming links with other people in Brichane, because the band was a predominantly working class band in a predominantly middle class village, and it had to work hard to keep its reputation up. Now, the events we were getting invited to with Shankill Road Defenders were quite different. They weren't for a national charity. They were for individual families who were suffering hardship, families from the local area. And the performances were quite different too, whereas Sir George White Memorial had focused on folk tunes and military marches and entertainment stuff with part harmonies, military drumming, a very respectable appeal to a wide range of people. In these events, we were mostly playing party tunes for a local working class crowd who wanted to sing. So the events were very different, and it has to be said that some of the tunes that were sung were sectarian. I mean, you could argue all of them were, in that they're all about loyalist solidarity. It depends how you define sectarianism. But I've defined sectarianism in my writing as discrimination based on perceived adherence to an ideology. Any ideology. Could be religion, could be political.
Yeah.
So the songs that were being sung, there were songs, there were orange songs, there were songs about the UVF or the UDA. There were songs that many people would consider sectarian. But they were being sung in an event which was organised for entirely humanitarian reasons.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought, why is that? What's going on here? And the fact that we were getting invited to quite a number of these events, and I was seeing on Facebook lots of other bands advertising similar events, made me start thinking, well, why is this happening now? And why is it that when people want to put on a charity event to raise money for a local family in hardship, they call a flute band and not, for example, a country band or a DJ?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what started me on that chapter.
Okay, so you'd obviously noticed early on in terms of your original kind of studies that there was this connection, that bands were doing things, they're doing more than just turning up the parades. And then as you kind of experience this thing of, bands being invited along to what were specifically functions related to raising money for charity, that kind of sparked a wee bit more of your interest in regards to, well, what are bands doing in regards to this idea of, I suppose, like social care or social enterprise in some shape or form in regards to that. And I suppose that it's an interesting kind of angle to look at in terms of bands being a form of social infrastructure within the Protestant community. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about it, you kind of linked it a wee bit, and I think you would be hinting at it there, was in regards to, it was part 2008, in terms of austerity and all that kind of stuff. What do you think changed on the ground that in working class communities that pushed bands into this role even more?
Well, I do think the 2008 crisis probably had an important effect. And I finished my PhD research in 2008, and I wrote the book I finished writing it in 2009. And I put at the end, I've painted a pretty optimistic picture of the band world here and of the peace process in Northern Ireland. But you have to bear in mind, we've just lived through what's probably the most prosperous time that working class people in Northern Ireland have ever had. Probably the best life had ever been for working class people in Northern Ireland was really from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement until the 2008 crash. And I said, everything's going to change now. And sure enough, it did change. Life got much harder for many people.
Okay.
And I think and after a few years of that, that's when bands had to respond to it. And I say had to respond because in our case, we didn't go looking to play at charity events. It was like people were asking us, and we were looking at what these events were about and said, well, we can't say no to that. If we have the people, we have to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose there's an element, and in my mind as well, there's been this thought generated, and I think it echoes really well within what you've written in the chapter, Gordon, is that Bonds, bond halls, and bond activity is some of the most consistent activity that takes place within a community. It's almost like some of the most consistent resources within working class communities where bonds are prevalent is the bond hall. It is the bond. And, businesses come and go, funding comes and goes, but the bond is almost like one of those staples.
Absolutely. That's very much the case. And one of the reasons for that is that bands are not in any sense tied into the economy of profit. Nobody in a band is paid for anything they do. An enormous amount of work is done in organising, in getting hold of uniforms, in getting buses, and of course in teaching youngsters. And nobody's paid for any of that. And that's what a band is, a social resource. And it's an enormous social resource. And in terms of infrastructure, it's tied into other social resources. For example, the football supporters clubs, the Orange Halls, which provide venues for bands to play. And this is a resource or a range of resources that people depend on to get by in everyday life. And it's something that Northern Ireland has that many other places don't have. Not only do we have more musicians than anywhere else, but because we have these musical organisations, they're capable of doing things such as organising charity events and so on.
Yeah, and you often find that the bonds are actually really motivated by that internally anyway. You've already mentioned about, some of these events being linked to personal experience, bond members' families have experienced something or whatever else. And I'm thinking along the lines of, my own bond with Pride of the Raven. Every year our parade or our annual event has always been charity related, even from the early 80s, and it's always related to an experience that's been had by a member of the bond. Whenever you were kind of doing your research and looking into things for this particular chapter, what kind of needs do you think were prevalent in terms of what you experienced going out to talk to people, etc.? What kind of things came up as needs there in terms of, was it like food, was it money, was it economics? What kind of things came out?
Well, normally it was money. And the first gig that I wrote about was for a family on the Shankill who had the father of the family was in hospital in Cambridge. And his treatment was all paid for by the NHS, but his family couldn't afford to visit him. So the gig was to raise money so his family could go and spend time with him. Now, there were a lot of other gigs with similar aims. There were others which were raising money for treatment. The Nicole Adams appeal, for example, which Clockfern Young Conquerors were involved in. The Poppy O campaign that Gertrude Starr were involved in. The Cameron Truesdale campaign, which Band Bridge Pride. I've forgotten the name of the band. I'm ashamed of myself.
You're all good. Don't worry about it. I'm sure they'll forgive you.
Yeah, so the Cameron Truesdale campaign, they were raising money for treatment. So sometimes it was for treatment, sometimes it's to enable people to visit. In all cases, it was because there wasn't enough money available to meet the needs of the families concerned. In one case, it was to enable the family to take a holiday together with their disabled child.
Well, which flies in the face of the popular perception of what a bondsman or a bondsperson is. As you said, in terms of the lead off of this, that sometimes people are only reading about the bad incidents that are taking place, but yet here we have something that's the complete antithesis of that.
Absolutely. And it's not either or either. I mean, there's a reason that bands have that reputation, is that many of the bands that exist today, in fact, most of the bands that exist today were formed during the 1970s, during the Troubles. And they were joined by young men who had something to say politically and wanted to express themselves on the streets. And many of those young men came from deprived backgrounds and were drawn into violence, of anything from street fighting to paramilitary activism. So there's no denying that bands have been involved in sectarian violence, and that it's one element of the reality of living in any working class area in Northern Ireland on either side of a sectarian divide. At the same time, there's much more to bands than that. There's much more going on. They're a centre of social life. They're a centre of cultural life, of cultural experimentation, of musical change. And they're also social resources that are able to take on tasks that are beyond just playing music.
Yeah. One of the phrases you used in the chapter was this whole idea of taking care of our own. What does that kind of mean within that kind of Protestant bond context?
That's a term that I felt summed up the ethic of bands, but it also sums up the ethic of most working class communities that I've ever encountered, and that includes England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the south of Ireland, and America. Now, how we define our own varies from one place to another according to the history and culture of the particular place. But working class communities are always about loyalty. And in that sense, Republicans are just as much loyalists as loyalists are.
I love hearing that.
They take care of their own too. And it's something that doesn't exist in the same way in the middle class. And I know that, having lived in both worlds, living in being an academic in the later parts of my life. So middle class people don't have to take care of each other to the same extent, because when they run into trouble, they have things to fall back on. They have savings, they have investments, they have property, they have qualifications. They have things that can help them get out of trouble. Working class people only have each other. So solidarity is vital for working class people. And taking care of your own is how that's enacted in practice. So when I ask myself, why are people singing sectarian songs at a humanitarian event? That's why. We're asking people who have not very much to give to people who are in even more vulnerable situations than themselves. And they need to know that if they are ever in that situation, this community is going to be there for them too. So a shared identity is vital.
Yeah. No, 100%. But I think it's important to kind of highlight, and I think one of the things that we've talked about, the idea of charity in terms of bonds, that it's not done to be recognised. You know, I mean, it's not done to say, oh, look at us, look at what we're doing. It's very much a case of it's felt. There's a deep seated feeling attached to it, isn't there, Gordon? It's like it's felt within them, and it's like kind of going, like you said, if I was in this position, I would want someone to be able to do this for me, and that's really comes across strongly.
Well, there's no question that, and even those bands that said to me, we do want to improve our image and this will help, also said that we saw a need, and in all cases, the need was seen because it was people they knew, it was people their band members knew. It was people in their streets, their communities who needed help. And whether that was the kind of thing that I spoke of already, for example, hospital visits or treatment, or during COVID-19, people needing food parcels, people needing someone to knock on their door and see if they were okay. Bandsmen were seeing people in their communities who needed that and saying, we can do that. We have the people here, the youth, the enthusiasm, the ability to do something about this, so let's do it.
Yeah.
And that applied to all the bands that I encountered who were involved in this kind of work.
Brilliant. So we're going to explore this a wee bit further. One of the things that we've been doing over the last while is introducing new voices into the podcast and stuff. And I have a co-host that I'm doing some sharing of the duties on the podcast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over the next section of this to Sarah, Gordon. So bear with us, folks, as we move into another section.
Well, Gordon, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to continue this conversation with you. I was struck when reading your chapter about the human stories that you use to kind of put across what's going on in the band scene in terms of charity and social work, and the case studies that you use to really reflect what's going on there. Could you talk to me a wee bit about some of the Gertrude Starr projects, like maybe the Ulster Fry breakfasts or the pensioners vouchers, what you saw going on there and what struck you about those kinds of initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gertrude Starr's work with pensioners is a very good example of work that was inspired by a perceived need. And Ron from Gertrude Starr, who I interviewed about these projects, told me how he remembered when he was a young bandsman, there was a pensioner who used to come to the band every month and give them quite a large amount of money. Possibly they thought more money than he could afford. And they would try and talk him out of it, but he was adamant that he wanted the band to have this money to educate young people in music. So Ron was explained that people like this pensioner had taken care of them. They wanted to return that care. And particularly during the time of COVID-19, pensioners had a great need for care. They were isolated, they were in many cases stuck on their own, and they needed food and they needed other help. So that was what inspired them to get involved in both the pensioners' vouchers scheme around the Freedom Corner area, and also the Ulster Fried Breakfast, which was putting on meals in the Westbourne Social Club, where Gertrude Starr practiced, the Glens Football Supporters Club. So Gertrude Starr were also heavily involved in the campaign for Poppy O, who was a relative of a band member suffering from a brain tumour. And that was a long-term project in which funding was raised over a considerable period of time to help that family. So Gertrude Starr were involved in a lot of charity projects. They really took it on and pushed forward with it. And one of the foremost bands in this line of work, but far from the only one. There were many more involved in similar work, and particularly during COVID-19, very large numbers of bands got involved in this kind of work.
You've touched on this really well already, but what struck you most about the way band members were able to identify need in their own streets?
Well, the reality is, of course, they lived in the deprived areas in which the people were most in need of help. And that's because the band scene is an overwhelmingly working class culture. And more so really since the Troubles than it ever was before. During the Stormont years, there was significant middle-class involvement in bands as well. From the outbreak of the Troubles, the middle classes largely withdrew from the band scene, partially because their political commitments were changing, partially because they were scared to go into the working class areas where bands were based. And quite a number of bands, certainly on the Shankill, for example, folded because of that. Prior to the Troubles, the Shankill had pipe bands, it had brass band, it had competition flute bands, and it had accordion bands, and all of those were gone by the end of the 1970s.
Just really about sort of identifying need in their own communities and how that happens, how that kind of comes across.
Okay, yeah. So they were seeing it in their own families and neighbours, and that was very often the motivating factor that drove bands to take action. They lived in the communities where the need was greatest, and therefore it was right in front of them. And they saw, A, that the need was there, and B, that they had the capability to do something about it.
Yeah, quite a natural solution in many ways.
Indeed, yes.
With Clough-Fearn Young Conquerors, you talk about a band with a very heavy Troubles era reputation, moving towards charity work, mental health awareness and fundraising. How did that shift look from the inside?
That's a good question. So I spoke to committee members from Clough-Fearn Young Conquerors at some lengths about this. And I had, in my first book, I described Clough-Fearn Young Conquerors as Ulster's most notorious paramilitary band. Now, when I told them that I'd said that, they didn't argue. But they did say that they were living in a different situation now. And during the Troubles, the primary threat that they saw facing their community was Republican violence. And they viewed their role as responding to that violence, if necessary, by further violence. When I interviewed them, they accepted that that was over. The troubles were finished. They didn't need to engage in violence, and therefore they changed their approach. And moreover, the threat was different. They were not under threat of Republican violence anymore, but they were under threat of all kinds of health issues, and particularly mental health issues, which particularly are affecting young working class men of the kind that they had in their band. And again, we have the fact that they were motivated to action when one of their own band members sadly committed suicide. Now, prior to his death, a local charity based in Ardoyne had done their best to help him, and they therefore decided to work on behalf of that charity to help others from all communities who were facing those kind of issues. So it was driven by the experience of their own, of taking care of their own.
And just following on from that, from your research and what you have seen, how do these projects affect, well, A, the people that they're helping, B, the band's relationship with the local community, and C, of course, the band members themselves?
Yes. So to take the first one, how did it affect the people they're helping? It can make a real difference. Substantial amounts of money have been raised, and you really couldn't get a better example of that than the campaign for Nicole Adams, which was run by which Clockfern Young Conquerors participated in and ran events for. So Nicole Adams was the sister of a member of Clockfern Young Conquerors, married to a boxer from Ardoyne, Kieran McVarnock. And she was suffering from cystic fibrosis. The NHS did not provide the treatment that she needed, and she was on a path to death. There's no question about that. Now, Clockfern Young Conquerors set out to raise money to get her the treatment she needed, but they also campaigned through the local DUP representative, Nigel Dodds at the time, for the NHS to provide the treatment. And that campaign was successful. So the NHS eventually did provide the treatment. Nicole Adams recovered quite swiftly, quite seemed miraculously. And not only did Nicole Adams benefit from that, but all other cystic fibrosis sufferers in the UK benefited from that, because those drugs are now available for them too. So it was a huge achievement, which started by an effort to save one band member's sister. Yes, it benefits the people. It absolutely benefited the people they set out to help. There are other cases where huge amounts of money were raised and it still didn't save the person. Cameron Truesdale, sadly, a vast amount of money was raised. He was sent for treatment to Mexico. It may have helped him live a little bit longer, but he died anyway. It's sad to talk about, let alone to experience. But it's still, of course, important that the bands and supporters came together to show solidarity, to do the best they could. And you can only know by trying. Sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes there's no guarantees it's going to work. And that's the reality of living in a deprived community where people don't have everything they need. And that's where most bands are coming from. Regarding what it does for bandsmen, it binds bands to their communities. It makes the band stronger, and it makes the relationship between the bands and the community stronger. Of course, this is one reason that this musical tradition is one of the strongest in Europe, and indeed even beyond Europe, because it does serve the communities in which it is based in a way that is appreciated and understood, and that people want to be a part of.
Thank you. I had also noticed in the language in your chapter and so on, you really don't shy away from acknowledging the sectarian and violent history of some parts of the band scene. Why was that sort of important to compare and contrast with the charity work that's going on, and to acknowledge that alongside it?
Well, I think first of all, because the reality is Northern Ireland, for historical reasons, which nobody alive today has much control over, is a sectarian society. Our politics, our social lives, and our cultural lives all tend to be defined by which side of the sectarian boundary we are on. If we're born on the orange side, we're more likely to live on the Shankill than the Falls. We're more likely to vote Unionist and Nationalist. We're more likely to be Protestant than Catholic, even if we're not really religious at all. And these are realities. And moreover, we're more likely to feel solidarity with other people like us. That's how this society is organised. Now, that can lead to terrible tragedies, as we all know from the experience of the Troubles. But there was an anthropologist called Rosemary Harris who studied sectarianism in, I believe it was County Tyrone, in the 1950s. And she made the point that the sectarian division in this rural area was real, and it had damaging effects. But it also had positive effects. She made the point that in the village that she researched, social life on both sides of the sectarian divide was intensified because everybody mattered to their neighbours. Nobody was forgotten about. Nobody was left out. And so sectarianism is a complicated phenomenon. We can't deny it's there. So our entire political and social system is built around it, for better or worse. It doesn't have to lead to mass violence. There have been long periods in Northern Ireland's history and the history of Ireland, going back even further, where people from different communities have lived peacefully together. And thankfully, we're living in one of them. It's not a perfect time and it's not a perfect situation, but there are lots of people in worse situations. And I don't just mean in Palestine or Iran. I'm thinking about American cities and indeed English cities, where there are working class communities that don't have the kind of solidarity that communities here on both sides of the divide can offer their members. So sectarianism is a complicated issue. We can't pretend it's not there. But we also have to understand why sectarian solidarity is important to people. And in many cases, it's because it's a resource that they need.
I think it is worth recognising in terms of those resources that some of the fundraising you describe directly benefits people from nationalist and Catholic backgrounds. How do band members kind of make sense of that? Is there a subtle building of bridges that's perhaps not seen or ignored by the wider political conversation?
I think there is, and I don't think it's even that bands necessarily set out to do that, but the work they undertake leads them in that direction. So to return to Clockfern Young Conquerors, they set out to save the sister of a band member. In doing so, they also saved the wife of a Catholic from Ardoi, who in fact was in charge of the fundraising effort and to whom they were handing over the money to disperse it. So I did talk to them about that, and their answer was, and this was also true in regard to the charity they supported, the mental health charity, that this charity had helped Protestants and was still helping Protestants, that disability and sickness and mental or physical health didn't discriminate on the basis of politics or religion, and that by helping other people, they were also helping their own people. And this was a recognition that they're no longer living in a time of war, that we can reach across boundaries without in any way betraying who we are. And I think that the fact that they felt they could do that shows that really anybody can do that.
You have touched on how from the outside some of these events might look very partisan. There's, flags, potentially songs that might be seen as sectarian, loyalist displays of kind of culture and so on. But the outcomes are often cross-community and humanitarian in their focus, rather than benefiting or focusing on a particular cause or ideology. So what is it that we're missing if we only look at those surface aesthetics?
Well, there's a number of issues there. So the first is that loyalty to our tribe, regardless of which tribe it is important to all of us in Northern Ireland and indeed elsewhere. And it's particularly important in deprived communities that can't rely on much else. At the same time, the fact that we may disagree with somebody else's politics and despise their football team doesn't mean that we hate them as an individual, doesn't mean we want them to come to harm, and doesn't mean that we won't help them if we see that they need help. And I think that was very evident in the reactions of bands to working across communal divides. They had no problem with it whatsoever. Another example was the charity Light of Foot, which was specifically set up to offer mental health care to bands people, not even loyalists, to bands people specifically. They very soon found that people were contacting their Facebook page were not just bands people, and were not just from Northern Ireland. There were people from the Republic of Ireland, there were people from Britain, from the USA, from Canada, and from everywhere from South Africa to the Philippines. And they responded to everyone who wrote to them, they responded to, regardless of who they were or where they came from, and did their best to offer what they could to those people. And that, again, it's a very human reaction. Human beings are, and you can often get a different impression when you read about Northern Ireland, but people in Northern Ireland, regardless of their political and religious opinions, are, for the most part, decent, humane people who want to help other people. And when the opportunity is there to do it, they'll do it.
Some really, really positive takeaways from that in terms of cross-community outreach, building up communities, people within those communities as well. But of course there will be detractors who say it's just a PR stunt. You know, they don't mean it. They're not actually interested in charity. They're trying to save their reputation, look good, because obviously the media can be quite harsh in its view of bands people. What would you say about that? You know, you've conducted long-term field research into that. What are the takeaways? Is it a PR stunt, or is it something that is completely authentic?
Again, I don't think it's necessarily either or. Certainly bands were conscious that doing charity work could raise their profile. But in many of these cases, it actually didn't, because they didn't take the trouble to publicise it. They just did it. That was particularly true during COVID-19. So, for example, the Shankill Old Boys donated a significant amount of money, which they had raised to buy a new uniform, to the NHS during COVID. That was never publicised. I found that out by through a post on Facebook, which I had put on asking, has any band been doing charity work? And one of their members posted about, we did this. It wasn't in the newspapers. It wasn't on the radio. And that was true of lots of other bands here and in Scotland who had undertaken major charity work during COVID-19 with little or no publicity at all. So yes, sometimes bands want to improve their image, and Clotfern Young Conquerors said to me, we realise that we have developed a bad image and we need to improve our relationship to our own community, let alone any other community. And we're setting out to do that, and this is how. But they also said we could see a need. Yeah. It was, in the words of one of their members, these things are close to home. It's our own people. So yes, there's sometimes bands are interested in improving their image. Much of the time, that's not their primary interest. And even when it is, if they're doing good, it's a good thing.
Gordon, absolutely fascinating stuff here. And one of the things that I did want to bring out in terms of from reading the chapter was, and it's something I'm noticing a lot in regards to how bonds and how some people within the bonding community are starting to try and talk. And I suppose in some sense, maybe reframe how bonds are either explaining what they do or connecting to sort of different types of sociological ideas, theories, etc., to kind of give a different voice and a different kind of explanation for some of the activity that they're involved in. One of the things that you use in the chapter is this idea of communities of practice. How does that kind of concept help us understand bond life?
So communities of practice is an idea that came from the world of education. A theorist called Etienne Wenger came up with this idea. And it's a theory of identity and community. And Wenger argues that who we are is not who we say we are or who we think we are. It's who we make ourselves by what we do. So you are what you do. And in particular, you are what you do with other people. So bands are widely seen, particularly loyalist bands, are seen as political organisations more than musical organisations. And that's why you only tend to ever see them on the TV when there's some kind of political controversy going on, at least until very recently. When I joined my first band and indeed subsequent bands, I noticed that when you were in band practice, nobody ever talked about politics or religion. They talked about music a lot. After that, probably football was the next most popular topic. Politics, religion, no. They just weren't part of it. So when I also thought about what's the differences between the concert band and the melody band and the Blood and Thunder band, and you looked at what they actually did in their practices, what they did was very different things. So the concert band sat behind music stands and went over and over the same piece of classical music until they got it absolutely perfect. The melody band also sat behind their music stands, but there was a lot more banter going on. And they'd play a range of different tunes, different styles of tunes, practicing a broad repertoire because they were focused on the street. So the way they interacted with each other was different because what they were doing was different. And the Blood and Thunder band was different again. They had a practice space which really wasn't up to the job. It was a very small space. And they had to cram in, so you had people perched on the edges of armchairs, people sitting on the floor. The drummers couldn't bring their drums into the room because it would have completely drowned out the sound of the flutes. So they drummed on a piece of plywood put over the pool table. And this influenced the way, the kind of music they played and the way they performed on the street as well. So what you do makes you who you are. And what they didn't do was spend time talking about politics and religion. So in this sense, bands are what you would think they would be. They're musical organisations first and foremost. They're not political groups, even though that's what people tend to focus on. It's not to say they're completely apolitical, but the politics is very much a secondary thing.
Yeah. So with that in mind, Gordon, if we were trying to explain to a policymaker, because we've already kind of hinted at, that this idea of the social infrastructure, the resources that bonds are within their communities. If we were kind of trying to explain to someone in terms of a policymaker and government structure as to why bonds actually matter, using some of the theoretical concepts that you kind of hit within that chapter, what would you say to those people?
Well, bands are providing services to their community. And this was emphasised to me by Ron from Gertrude Starr when I interviewed him, is that he said even when we're not doing charity work, we're still contributing to the community in massive ways. For example, we're educating children who have conditions such as ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and so on. And we're educating children that the school can't educate. And that's just one important aspect of what bands are doing. They're also providing a social space, particularly for young men who are those most at risk of mental health and suicide, not just in Northern Ireland, but more widely. And that's something that Northern Ireland has that a lot of other places don't have, a mutual support network, not limited to young men. There are also much older men such as ourselves, not to mention women in the van scene, and increasing numbers of women, it has to be said. But this is a social resource, and it works across a range of dimensions. And when someone is in difficulty, whether it's financial difficulty or mental health difficulty or physical health difficulty, they have a network that will support them. And that's vital, especially when the state isn't really doing that.
Yeah, no, and because it always reminds me of, I remember having a conversation back at my youth work days, and someone coming to me and going, "We need access to men, and I remember saying, I could get you access to like thousands, and I'm like, what is it? And I was going, yeah, marching bonds. Oh, no, don't want to go there. Like, oh, you just said you want access to men. Here's one of the, an activity that men are actively involved in, and are intrinsically interested in people who want to connect with them, and deal and go past the stereotype and so on. So I think it's something that it's definitely changing. I think that the attitude in regards to that is changing, and that's changing because I think the language that members of bonds are using to describe what they do and all these and trying to place it within the context of the outcomes that we are working towards are outcomes that everybody needs, not just people who are within bonds.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Glenn. And when it comes to policymakers, they need to understand the importance of bands in these working class communities. And this is something that differs between Loyalist and Republican communities. Republican communities also have bands, but for them, they're far less central to the social life of the community. The rebel band is far more important in Republican communities, but that works rather differently because it doesn't have the large numbers of people involved that marching bands have. So this is something that is specific to Loyalist communities, and hugely important, and has capabilities to do enormous amounts of good. And moreover, the people in the bands want to do that good. And many of them are actively working towards that in many ways. So this is something that should be supported, and to a large extent has not been supported, because bands have been seen as only for one side of the community or as being sectarian. And there's been, unquestionably, a level of class prejudice against working class types of sociality. So that's what I would say to policymakers. And thankfully, I'm not the only one saying it. I think a lot of bands people are getting the message over in a lot of different ways. And we are starting to be listened to in a way that we haven't been in the past.
Yeah.
And the foundation of the Belfast Bands Forum is a welcome development in that regard. A lot of pioneering work done by the Londonderry Bands Forum, which is really important as well. So I do think that policymakers are starting to get the message. That doesn't mean we can
rest on our laurels. Yeah. And I think that leads me nicely into the last section of this, in terms of how I thought about framing the conversation with you, Gordon, and that's about the future of the bond scene and the communities that they're working within. In your conclusion, and I think you argue that loyalism will outlast the idea of constitutional change because there's a need for that social infrastructure. What do you think bonds are going to look like in 20 to 30 years' time?
That's a fascinating question, and I can put my neck on the line here. The reality is, of course, I don't know. I don't know how they will change, but I know they will change. As social conditions change, bands will change as they've changed in the past. So we saw that the fife and drum in the 19th century replaced by the flute band, and then the diversification into accordion bands and brass bands and pipe bands. And then we saw the blood and thunder revolution of the 1970s, when the complete style of flute bands changed and that's now the largest genre of flute band for both economic and social and political reasons. There's a whole range of factors involved in why that happened. And we're now seeing Blood and Thunder, when it started, was a youth culture. Well, we're not everybody in these bands is as young anymore. And those bands are also changing because they're learning to do new things. They're developing new interests. They're working from their tradition, as indeed other kinds of bands are, melody bands, concert bands. But they're learning to do things in new ways.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things, which I always loved about bands from the start, was that they would play any tune that they liked. They didn't care if it was a classical piece, if it was a pop song, if it was a 300-year-old Orange song, or indeed if it was a nationalist song. They just changed the words if they didn't like the words. A good tune is going to get played regardless of what it is. And I think it was Ray Charles said there's only two kinds of tune: good tunes and bad tunes. But that's very much the way that bands approach it. And that's a real strength, I think, which is something that a lot of other genres don't have, because they have idea, well, this is our tradition, this is what we play, we can't play that because that's different. Bands will play anything.
It's an open book, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So it means that the openness to creativity is enormous.
No. One of the things I did want to ask you about, in light of that, everything we've kind of talked about here, is what do you think the biggest threats are to the positive social roles that bands are currently playing?
Well, the reality is that the overwhelming majority of bandsmen are living in deprived communities. And that comes with a range of issues. And I have seen many of them, and I'm sure you have too, that have, for example, taken people away from bands, ranging from people who can't walk anymore at the age of 50, who can't walk 3 miles, to people who succumb to addictions and mental health issues, and people whose physical health just holds them back from participating, even though they still want to. And I've seen people many years younger than me who've had to drop out of bands for physical reasons. I've also seen people drop out for mental health reasons, for addiction reasons. And I'm sure you can tell these stories too. And the positive thing, of course, is the bands are there for them, but it doesn't alter the tragedy that these things are happening to them in the first place.
Yeah. No, and I think there's an element where you kind of live in it's not quite a paradox, but you kind of live within, I'm thinking of, the cartoon kind of thing, where you're faced with decisions about the future. You have the wee devil on one side and the angel on the other side. And I suppose every society, every community has threats, things that would influence, and we have a choice to make about what way that we want to go. And I think at the minute, a lot of bands are making positive choices around what they want to do with their time and how the things that they support and so on. But there's also the underlying political current that kind of exists there that could potentially derail some of that type of stuff. I'm thinking about some of the stuff you've mentioned, and even, the wider world politics and stuff like that there can kind of be seen as a draw and be pulling, the left-right kind of thing that's, it's very prevalent, and especially across social media and, all those kind of things could potentially be, a threat if there was a major change to the political landscape here, it could potentially have an impact there. But I'm really excited about, where the band scene is right now. I'm really excited about, what it's trying to do with itself and how it's trying to present itself and how it's trying to make changes. Because one of the things that's evident, you mentioned about the idea of music, is change and progression is almost expected. It's not like, let's do this. It's there's always a push There's always something. We can't be content with where we are. We need to do something that's either bigger, better. That's part of the human condition as well. We want to progress. We want to feel like we're doing stuff. But it's really exciting to see that within the bond scene.
Absolutely. And on the downside, as you mentioned, politics can, of various kinds, can cause problems. Another reason I've seen band members lost from the band is because they've ended up in jail. It's a reality in working class communities. It happens to a lot of people in working class communities. But yes, the band scene is in, I think, a great place at the moment. It's strong, it's diverse, it's open to change, it's open to new kinds of creativity. My own band, Shankill Road Defenders, we've been involved in a whole range of musical projects. We played with Irish traditional musicians, we played with Colombian musicians from South America. We played with Afghans and Ghanaians, and playing music with other people is fun, however you do it. And lots of other bands have been involved in similar projects as well, and different projects.
Yeah.
So that's all good stuff. At the same time, we're marching bands. That's what we do. That's who we are. Communities of practice. We don't forget that. But you always want something new to lift a crowd.
Yeah.
You're always looking for that new tune that will lift the crowd. So as you come down the road, you see people start to move.
Yeah.
And the other element of it is competition, both on parade and in indoor events. And that also drives innovation and what can we do that nobody else can do. And that drives bands onwards. And there's an old saying in the band world, there's no bad bands. There's good bands and there's bands that are trying to get better.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely a reality. There's no bands that are not trying to be better tomorrow than they are today.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people out there giving it their best.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think you just have to look, not that far away from where we're sitting tonight. I mean, even as we were preparing tonight, there was bonds on the street, in terms of, honored a member of a band. He passed away there, but also the amount of time that is spent in practice, the amount of energy that's given to practice, and even for bonds that are only doing a certain amount of events. I was thinking about, the church flute band over in East Belfast. I was looking at their recent Facebook posts and it's like kind of going, main band practice on a Tuesday, flute practice on a Thursday, and drum practice on a Friday. And this is a band that only does a certain amount of events, throughout the year, but yet are knocking in 3 nights worth of practice.
Absolutely. And I particularly admire the people who are tutoring learners, who are spending hours before the band practice, sometimes after the band practice, and often on the weekend as well.
Exactly.
Bring people on, convincing them they can actually do this. Just because they're getting terrible squeaks when they start doesn't mean they can never play a flute.
Exactly.
And it's an enormous amount of work, and it's all done for free.
Yeah.
And it's important stuff.
Brilliant. Well, just in closing, I'm just going to fire a few quick fire closing reflections at you and stuff. That one bond moment that you've witnessed, Gordon, that will stay with you.
Okay, this was with Shankill Road Defenders coming out of Shaftesbury Square on the 12th. Now, every bands person knows, who's in Belfast knows what that's like on the 12th. And as usual, there was a massive crowd on either side of the street. They were singing along. I think we were playing My Old Man. But there was one thing that was different from usual. The crowds were behind fences. One woman, and she looked like a Chinese woman, had somehow got across or through the fence. And she was a beautifully dressed woman. And she was stood out in front of the fence with her arms thrown back like that and her head back, like she was bathing in the music. She was like... you could just, the sound was washing over her and she was loving it. So I have no idea who she was, where she came from, or how she got to be there, but she was having a wonderful time.
Brilliant. Well, that's good. I love that. Another one here, a stereotype about Loyalist bonds you'd love to retire.
Well, this is obviously there's a few to choose from, but the thuggery one is just the idea that bandsmen are basically violent people and people we should be frightened of is just an absurd distortion. Not to say that no one in bands has ever been involved in violence. Of course, they have. But the vast majority of bands people are decent people. They don't want to hurt anybody, and they don't want to see anybody hurt.
Yeah.
And it's just infuriating when you repeatedly encounter that kind of thing.
Yeah. This will be an interesting one thing bands people don't realise about their own power.
Most bands people don't realise what good musicians they are. And that goes back to the very first parade I saw in 2000. And I followed that band. And they were a run-of-the-mill band. And that was kind of what I found interesting about them. Because they were able to put on a performance. They were able to lift a crowd. And they were able to enjoy themselves. And there were 50 other bands, at least, that could also do that. It's so musical accomplishment. Bands are better than they think they are. They're also, because they're well-organised groups, able to achieve things like running the charity events that they did, particularly during COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, was when a lot of bands realised the capabilities they had because people came to them because they could do it.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. And the confidence, I think, which I think is absolutely there now, but maybe hasn't been in the past. But a lot of people worked hard to make this. The confidence to know that what we do is good and it's important, and it should be valued. I think bands are appreciating that now, perhaps in a way that they haven't in the past.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about every band, from the concert bands to the Blood and Thunder band. Every band, what they do is valuable.
Yeah. A tune that sums up band life for you.
I love Listening Aid. It's a jig. I believe it was once an Orange song, but I think the words are long lost. It's an absolutely cracking tune. It's not played by anyone other than bands. It could be played by fiddlers or any other kind of, but I've never heard it played by anyone other than a flute band. And most flute bands that do play it have their own version.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that tune.
Brilliant. And then just in closing, last question is, what do you hope people will understand differently about Loyalist bands after either reading your chapter in this new book and us, or just through listening to this conversation?
I hope they'll understand their social and cultural importance, and also how unusual a culture like this is. England doesn't have this. Most of Western Europe doesn't have any kind of musical culture of this scale or the centrality to social life, which bands have here. And it's a strength of Northern Irish society. It's a thing of value that we have that many other places don't have.
Gordon, I think that's a great place to finish this episode off. Absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you on, and for us to kind of go off on maybe a different kind of tangent or a different kind of subject matter, because I think it's important that we, and I use this loosely and sometimes, start talking about things more intellectually about what's going on in terms of the band scene, because as we've talked a lot about tonight, that's not necessarily everybody's, opinion of, without losing the grassroots element of what we do. I think it's important to get a balance of that, and I think that your chapter, the first book that you've done has added loads to that. I know I'm always constantly referring to it in terms of my own, my own study, my own kind of, think I'm getting myself prepared for talking to people and stuff like that there. And I think the more resource that we have that enables the members of the scene to talk about the what they do in that light is definitely beneficial for all of us. So thanks very much for coming down and spending some time with us.
Thanks very much, Glenn. I've enjoyed it.
So there we go. That's the end of another episode. Sarah, what did you make of that?
I found that absolutely fascinating. I've always been really interested I've always wondered, do people realise the charitable impact that bands have? And it's great to see that somebody so intelligent and switched on like Gordon is kind of looking into this and saying, here, it's actually making an impact. It must be so encouraging, not only for the families who have been helped by these bands, but for the bands people themselves who quite often don't seek any sort of validation or thanks for it. So
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant to look at.
No, and I think one of the things that was great about that is this idea of bonds as a resource and actually as infrastructure within the communities that they're based within, which is an interesting way of looking at what we do. And I think it's a great way for bonds to be reframing the role that they play within society, especially in the light of detractors, etc. I know we talk about that. And that's something I'm going to have to, I think we're going to put something in place this year to not use that terminology anymore and say, about our detractors. Let people talk, say what they need to say.
Absolutely.
But, we need to talk about what's important to us. So, no, definitely. And folks, if you haven't read that chapter or you want to get a hold of that chapter from Gordon, reach out to us or reach out to Gordon as a member of the Shanker Road Defenders and read that. It's a fantastic read, and well worth your time and energy. But that's us for now. We hope that you'll like the video and comment on it. And also
maybe if our listeners had a story about a charitable impact their band had made, they could reach out in the comments.
Yeah, if there's anything that strikes you from the conversation that we've had with Gordon, then please, we'd love to hear about that stuff too. It's always good to hear from the listeners and the watchers on YouTube. But as we're saying, make sure you like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Remember, subscribing doesn't cost you anything. All it does is help push the content that we're creating out to people who may want to see it. And with that in line, we're just going to say what we normally say at the end of this. Folks, that's it for now. So look after yourself and take it easy.